Native Japanese people of Reddit, what do you think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing? Native Japanese here. I don't have much to say about the political/tactical viewpoint since I'm not an expert, just a civilian. And I think that goes for most other civilians as well. The people who lived through it, or whose parents and grandparents lived through it, only know the suffering it caused. In school we were taught dry facts about war, very little emphasis on why any decisions were made. But we did learn a lot about the effects on the common people, to the point where I was tired of spending so much time on it. We visited the bombing sites, heard survivors speak, touched the keloid scars on their arms that still burn decades later. We folded paper cranes and were taught songs that denounced war and promoted peace, as though we were going to be able to make a difference. Today, most of us live quiet lives and don't think about the atomic bombs, or the firebombing of Tokyo, or the land conflicts in Okinawa. But if asked, nearly every family has a war story, of would-be grandparents who died or children who starved because they were far enough from the conflict but were still affected by the wartime economy. It's just part of life. We carry the inherited memory of suffering. Reddit really lost its magic when you realized it's a bunch of armchair experts. Once I got into my professional field and started seeing comments on Reddit about how it works and they're all completely fucking misinformed dipshits spouting shit they just think sounds right, I lost faith in finding useful information on here. Have even had Redditors tell me how the very basic core functions of my job, digital advertising, works and how wrong I am, and it's just so laughably wrong every time. I am a third-generation Hibakusha that lives overseas, meaning my grandparents survived the atomic bomb, Hiroshima. They were given special health care because of it. I grew up in Hiroshima. I have thought about the bombing all my life, just vaguely. For the last few years though, I have reached a conclusion that the use of the bombing was inevitable. Probably my family in Japan wouldn't like to hear me say this, though we never really talk about it, but there was no way the US wouldn't have used it, and if the Imperial Japanese government had access to it, they would have used it. Of course, I'm not an expert, but that's just how I feel. It is just how it is, however sad and depressing that is. Filipino here. Japanese soldiers would come to my grandmom's village, line up the young girls by the fields and collect male babies. They would throw the babies into the air and impale them to scare the young girls into the fields, then hunt them down and rape them. My grandmom managed to survive. She was small and hard to spot, but her legs were covered in scars. My granddad was a resistance commander, but even after the war, his superiors were too fearful of Japanese resurgence to let anyone go, so he deserted to Canada. The Japanese civilians obviously didn't deserve to be bombed, but I wish Canada history had taught a fuller picture. Native Japanese here. I've noticed that a lot of Japanese people are answering despite it being 4 a.m. and not being many Reddit users here. Through middle school or high school most students go on a field trip and common destinations are usually Hiroshima or Nagasaki. I went to Hiroshima when I was in middle school. So a lot of people have more or less have had personal experiences of knowing what the bombings were like. I don't mean first-hand experience, but going to the actual site and researching what happened or meeting actual survivors and that kind of stuff. So I guess to answer the question, I'm hoping atomic bombs won't be used again, or war in general for that matter. I can talk about my personal opinion, with the caveat that I moved to the US when I was 14 and have been here for about a decade now. There's some part of me that thinks that Hiroshima was somewhat necessary to expedite the end of the war. Though I'm sure Japan would have surrendered, who knows how long it would have taken without the bombings. I believe, however, that we would have surrendered without the Nagasaki bombings, and that bombing was largely a show of force by the US to act as a warning against the Soviet Union, and also trying to knock Japan out of the war before the Soviets got involved on the Pacific Front. They failed, obviously, given the Korean War. I'm from Japan. So well I am of the belief that it was a necessary evil. Should the bombings never have occurred, there would have been an invasion, which would have been a bloodbath. America seriously underestimated the IJA and IJAF, Air Force, who had correctly guessed American landed zones and had fortified them. Even with this underestimating, the Americans predicted 1,000,000 American losses. With Japanese mobilizing tens of millions of civilians and America having a force of 6 million, 1 million of whom are British, the invasion would get bloody. With millions dead on both sides. We're talking like 3.5 million dead and perhaps millions more wounded for the Americans. And tens of millions for the Japanese side. Along with the occupation and even worse devastation. A handful of downvoted, or not upvoted, comments is equivalent to y'all really bashing up. Your comment is a very annoying occurrence on Reddit. Make a post about an insignificant enemy/viewpoint that Redditors disagree with and bash it in exchange for upvotes. And to be fair, it's not your comment that annoys me, as much as that 5.4K that upvoted it without even seeing one example of people bashing up. I'm sure there are a dozen or so, but they are insignificant in the sea of positive/neutral comments, especially weighing upvoted comments proportionally higher. This is the most widely accepted argument in the US I've heard. During the island hopping that happened during the Pacific Theater, the battles were brutal simply because of the honor code Japanese soldiers followed. It wasn't like fighting Germany where a large sum of soldiers would surrender if need be. Japanese soldiers fought until the brutal end. If you were going to end a battle, you had to kill every single soldier. The idea was that if the US invaded the mainland, pretty much every single soldier on the continent would have had to been killed. Top that with the American soldiers that would have died, and while the war would have eventually ended, the casualties would have probably dwarfed those of the bombs. I'm from Japan. My views of it are very different now that I live outside of Japan compared to when I was younger and hadn't left Japan. When I was younger, I saw it as a horrible thing done to us, no excuses. No reason could justify the horrors of not only the nuclear bombs but also the firebombings. I saw it as the evil's war and what warlike mindsets could do to humanity. Japan was 100% the victim. When I was younger, it wasn't taught like Japan equals good, America equals bad. More of the bombs are the horrors of war, and this is why war is never a good thing. Now that I live in the US, I see it's not as simple or black and white. I now understand why the bombs were dropped. I still believe it was a horrible thing, but I do believe it stopped the war, which is a good thing. I now feel that what Unit 731 did is more of an example of what evil humanity can accomplish vs the nuclear bombs. But again, I no longer live in Japan and my viewpoint will not be the same as people who have lived there their whole life. I visited the Nagasaki bombing museum. The loss of life from the bombing was obviously horrific and unimaginable, but the museum was one of the more one-sided museums I have visited. The first room shows you pieces of a destroyed Catholic church and pictures of all the kids taking their first communion days before they got vaporized. The last room talked about the war. The only reference to Pearl Harbor was something along the lines of Japan entered the war because of its foreign policy at the time. The whole museum avoided any topic that might place some blame on both parties. Doesn't seem like a good way to learn and avoid similar atrocities in the future. There's a big contrast between German contrition and Japanese impenitence about WW2 atrocities. There are books on the subject, like this one. My wife is Japanese and didn't know a lot about what Japan did in WW2 until she went to a US university, and she thought comfort women among other war crimes were propaganda made up by the Koreans. Contrast that with Germany's lack of justification or revisionism. But she also doesn't think much about the bombings. I met some bombing survivors while living in Hiroshima, and the persons who cared more about the topic also talked about peace and reconciliation. Yeah, we have friends who are Japanese. but my wife is Korean and my great-uncle was tortured and killed for escaping from the Davao penal colony on Mindanao after the Bataan Death March. Another family friend escaped from a camp in Indonesia where his older brother was executed. He lived in the jungle with his mother for months. We try to be respectful of everyone, but it gets a bit hard when I see the denialists and minimizers. I don't know about the situation currently, but as recent as the first Abe administration, he had atrocity deniers in his cabinet and the nation didn't seem to mind. It's a really conflicting feeling. For the longest time, I felt there was no justifying the bombings. The bombings really helped to paint the country as a victim of war when being taught in Japanese history classes, and of course no one, including myself, would question it. It's only when you learn about the other side of the coin and hear about the atrocities that are hidden in Japanese education, such as Nanking and comfort women, that you realize that Japan isn't in the clear. To this day, I still do not like the fact that my country still go to lengths to forget about their own wrongdoings. Native Okinawan here. Okinawa is where the Japanese soldiers decided to fight for the last battle of World War II. If it wasn't for the bombs, I feel as thought the Japanese would have never surrendered and would have been completely massacred on the final Battle of Okinawa, along with even more Okinawan natives. The Japanese soldiers occupied our land and drove the native Okinawans to the mountains, scavenging resources from civilians and killing us if we didn't give up our hiding spots. My great-grandfather was stabbed in the stomach for not giving up his hiding cave but luckily survived. It's all terrible, but I can only imagine if those bombs weren't dropped, then what would have become of my people and the Japanese soldiers who were literally jumping off cliffs / disemboweling themselves / blowing themselves up, because they were told not to be captured as prisoners. I wish the Japanese had surrendered sooner, but they had too much pride. I grew up in the American South. My school didn't teach the Lost Cause mythology, but it was pervasive in the culture. It is really awful how easy it is to prey on kids and fill their heads with lies designed to cover up the past and enable bad things in the future. This is just speculation from an outside perspective. It seems to me like Japan uses the fact that people are frightened of nuclear technology, and, therefore, think that the use of them during World War II was somehow worse than firebombing or blockading to cover up for Japan's war crimes. I recognize that there are people who are genuine about their concern, but most of the time it feels like manipulative propaganda. I'm curious, do Japanese schools teach about Unit 731 or the rape of Nanjing? Here in the US, what's taught differs quite a bit from state to state and from teacher to teacher. Some of my friends from the South were taught about Hiroshima and Nagasaki as a source of pride, but in my school we were shown the devastation and effects of RHE radiation. Also, a lot of people were not taught about Japanese American internment camps in schools either. Very thorough analysis. Here's my take. My family is Korean and my grandmother lived during the Japanese occupation of Korea. From what my mother said about her, and she agrees with her on this, she believes that Japan got what was coming to them. Personally, I would have agreed too if the US had used the atomic bombs on military targets, not civilian ones. And yes, I'm very much aware of the atrocities that Japan committed, like the rape of Nanking and the comfort women, but the blame lies more with the government at the time, remnants of which still linger today. That, from what I've heard, the Japanese public thinks so little of its own government, even less so with what people like you learn from beyond Japan's borders. Despite the government's desperation to erase the past, proves to me that there's hope yet for Japan. There are a lot of factors to the dropping of the atomic bombs, too many to get into, but ultimately I think it was the correct thing to do. I think that conclusion is justifiable, but only just. There's the unknown effects of detonation, the massive loss of life, the politics surrounding Truman, the fact that the European theater was effectively won at that point, etc. On the other hand, it's worth keeping in mind that a full-scale invasion campaign would have been so costly to the Americans, in a conflict that they had to win, that the sovereignty of Japan, especially with the Soviet conflict looming, would have very much been in question. We may well have annexed Japan if we had to win through invasion. I bring up that I was a soldier so that I can say this: it's really not worth trying to justify the morality on either side, because wartime actions aren't really made with morality in mind. Both sides are trying to win a war, and both sides are going to do horrible things. It's very much worth remembering that war should be avoided at nearly any cost. Those that suffer the most from it are not the politicians that start the whole thing. It's a thing that scars everyone involved for generations, at best. This page has been an interesting read, one of the ones that makes Reddit worthwhile instead of a cesspool. I'm an American and a former soldier, Bush Jr. era, Iraq. I've always found World War II and especially the development of the atomic bomb fascinating. There is a lot of very important history there, from the theoretical scientific aspect down to the practical political and strategic positions. Lots of fog of war and two cultures that didn't understand each other very well as an active theater on the other side of the world, one of the most important conflicts in the 20th century. Here in the US, our history class briefly glosses over the tactics of the decision to drop the bombs. From my memory, every island battle up to that point had been a bloody slog, such as Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, and to our best knowledge the soldiers and civilians of Japan had been conditioned to resist to the very last. Civilians on islands were seen to commit suicide rather than surrender to advancing US troops. Had we gone through with a mainland invasion of Japan, it was expected that the US would lose thousands upon thousands of soldiers, and that the USSR, who by that point we were polarizing against in Europe, would have the chance to invade from the north. So, without better knowledge of how the bombs affected populated cities, it was determined to be much more politically expeditious and bloodless to drop atom bombs until the government surrendered, although, we only had enough sufficiently enriched uranium at the time to make the two bombs. I didn't know about the atrocities committed by Japan until much later. This isn't war-related, but related to countries excluding the bad stuff from history lessons in school. I'm Canadian and I never heard of residential schools until I was in my mid-30s, and only because it was in the news. I had to Google it to understand what they were talking about. It was not mentioned in our school system at all when I was growing up. I am Korean and was born/raised there for my early childhood. I was of the opinion that the bombing was 100% justified and held that belief firmly until I took a history class in the US, high school. We watched a documentary in class about the effect the bombing had on Japanese civilians, the survivors, their loss, and their horrible lifelong suffering and disabilities as a result of the radiation. The documentary humanized what I had previously only viewed as a monolith of the aggressors, and really just drove home the point that war is awful, and innocents suffer no matter what side they are on. I still have mixed feelings. While I am glad the outcome was that the US won and liberated Korea, saving our people, land, language, and culture, which was being systemically wiped out, none of those Japanese civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki deserved to be slaughtered like that. Native Japanese in my 20s. The bombings are in our collective mind, the representation of the atrocity of war. There's definitely a strong victim mentality and the general public do not imagine ourselves to be the aggressors of history. We are completely oblivious to the other st we have committed since the education system is structured in a way that let us sweep the past under the rug. We were graced by the US intervention that enabled us to erase any acknowledgement of our pasts and spent the last 75 years rebuilding our national identity around being meticulous hard workers. Our society is devoted to turning everyone into company robots malleable with zero backbone. Voter turnout for people in their 20s is about 30%. We don't think about politics and our knowledge of history is limited. So in short, bomb equals bad equals war, and that's about it.